I'm Edward, and I'm always delighted to meet here with you. Before we start, let me know, where are you listening from? I'd also love to know, in which place did you grow up, and how do you remember it? Share it in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe so you never miss our daily stories. Now, let's begin tonight's mystery. Chapter 1. The Garden. Everyone admired. The first days of June had settled over St Mary Mead with that particular quality of light which suggests summer has truly arrived, though the evenings still retained a pleasant coolness that encouraged sitting out of doors with a shawl and a sense of contentment. It was weather that brought people into their gardens and into conversation over hedges and gates, and it was therefore precisely the sort of weather in which news travelled with remarkable efficiency. The news presently occupying the village was of an entirely pleasant nature. Mrs. Eleanor Fawcett of Rosebery Cottage had agreed, after some persuasion, to open her garden for the annual summer charity afternoon. This was considered a considerable coup for the organising committee, as Mrs. Fawcett's garden was much admired but seldom displayed. She was not a woman who sought attention, and her garden reflected this quality precisely. It was a garden of restraint rather than ostentation, of careful planning rather than enthusiastic abundance, and those who had glimpsed it over the years spoke of it with a respect that bordered on reverence. Miss Marple, making her way along the High Street on a Wednesday morning, found herself party to no fewer than 3 separate conversations on the subject before she had reached the post office. Mrs. Price, emerging from the baker's with a loaf still warm enough to scent the air pleasantly, declared it a wonderful thing that dear Mrs. Fawcett had consented at last. Mr. Hartley, pausing in the arrangement of his shop window, observed that it was typical of Mrs. Fawcett's generosity, as she had always been public-spirited despite her natural reserve, and Miss Weatherby, encountered just outside the lending library, confided that she had heard the garden was to be opened in its absolute prime, and that Mrs. Fawcett had been planning the event with extraordinary attention to detail. Miss Marple listened to each observation with the gentle interest she brought to all village matters, and reflected, as she often did, that the manner in which a piece of news was discussed often revealed as much as the news itself. Mrs. Fawcett, it had appeared, occupied a position of considerable respect in St Mary Mead. She was described as generous, public-spirited, and possessed of good judgment. Her reserve was mentioned not as a fault, but as a virtue, suggesting a woman who knew her own worth without needing to assert it. It was the sort of reputation that took years to establish and was not easily shaken. Miss Marple had met Mrs. Fawcett on several occasions, though she could not claim to know her well. Mrs. Fawcett was a woman in her late 50s, handsome rather than pretty, with a composure that suggested both breeding and self-discipline. She dressed well, but without ostentation, spoke with quiet authority, and moved through village life with the assurance of someone whose position was secure and unquestioned. She had been widowed some 15 years earlier, and had managed her affairs with an efficiency that commanded respect. Her involvement in parish matters was steady rather than prominent. She served on committees, contributed to causes, and could be relied upon to shoulder responsibility without seeking recognition. Rosebery Cottage itself was situated at the edge of the village proper, a handsome stone building of modest size set well back from the road. The garden, which extended to perhaps an acre, was enclosed by old brick walls softened by climbing roses and ivy. From the road one caught only glimpses of what lay beyond, which perhaps contributed to its mystique. Those who had been invited to take tea with Mrs. Fawcett spoke of the garden as a place of remarkable harmony, where colour and form had been balanced with an artist's eye, and where every plant appeared to know its place and purpose. The charity afternoon was scheduled for Saturday, and as the week progressed, anticipation mounted in that quiet way characteristic of village events. There was much discussion of weather, of the best time to arrive, of whether one ought to bring contributions for the tea table, or whether Mrs. Fawcett would have made all necessary arrangements herself. The proceeds were to benefit the district nursing fund, a cause close to many hearts, and tickets had sold briskly. Miss Marple, who had been invited as a neighbour rather than required to purchase a ticket, had accepted with pleasure. She was fond of gardens, and fonder still of observing how people conducted themselves in social situations that required both formality and warmth. A garden opening of this nature was precisely the sort of occasion that revealed character, as it combined elements of display, hospitality, judgment, and the delicate navigation of village hierarchy. On Friday afternoon, Miss Marple encountered Mrs. Fawcett herself outside the greengrocer's. Mrs. Fawcett was carrying a basket of strawberries and appeared, if anything, more composed than usual. She greeted Miss Marple with genuine warmth, inquired after her rheumatism, and expressed hope that the weather would hold for the following day. "I confess I shall be relieved when it is over," Mrs. Fawcett said, with a smile that seemed both sincere and slightly weary. "One hopes to do justice to the occasion without appearing to make too much of it. There is always that balance to maintain." Miss Marple agreed that balance was indeed essential, and remarked that the village was much looking forward to the event. "You are very kind," Mrs. Fawcett replied. "I have been fortunate in having assistance with the preparations. Miss Allen has been particularly helpful, and Mr. Reed offered his services with the heavier work, though I assured him it was not necessary to trouble himself." She spoke with the graciousness of someone accustomed to managing helpers tactfully, and Miss Marple noted the names mentioned. Marjorie Allen was a woman of perhaps 40, unmarried, who gave a great deal of time to parish activities and was generally described as efficient though not particularly imaginative. Thomas Reed was a retired schoolmaster, a mild-mannered man who lived alone and took a somewhat anxious interest in local affairs, without quite knowing how to insert himself into them comfortably. Miss Marple was about to take her leave when she observed a subtle change in Mrs. Fawcett's expression, a momentary tightening around the eyes that suggested a concern being carefully controlled. "I wonder," Mrs. Fawcett said in a tone that remained perfectly pleasant, "whether you happened to notice anyone near my potting shed yesterday evening. I ask only because I appear to have mislaid a small ledger, and I'm trying to recall when I last saw it with certainty." Miss Marple considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "I'm afraid I was not out in the evening yesterday. What sort of ledger was it?" "Oh, merely a record of contributions and small accounts relating to parish matters," Mrs. Fawcett replied, with a dismissive gesture that somehow failed to dismiss the subject entirely. "Nothing of great consequence, but I do prefer to keep such things in order. Miss Allen was helping me in the shed late in the afternoon, and I thought perhaps I had set it aside somewhere unusual and forgotten. One's memory, you know, can play such tricks." She smiled as she said this, but Miss Marple, whose own memory was considerably sharper than she generally allowed others to, suppose detected something that was not quite ease in the manner of the statement. It was said lightly, almost carelessly, but there was a deliberateness beneath it, as though the ground was being prepared for something more significant than a simple misplacement. "I'm sure it will turn up," Miss Marple offered. "These things so often do, in the most unexpected places." "Indeed," Mrs. Fawcett agreed. "I'm certain you're right. Well, I must not keep you standing, Miss Marple. I shall see you tomorrow afternoon, and I do hope you will enjoy the garden." They parted with mutual expressions of goodwill, and Miss Marple continued on her way with a thoughtful expression. A mislaid ledger was, on the surface, a matter of no importance whatever, and yet something in the way Mrs. Fawcett had mentioned it, and particularly in her reference to Miss Allen's presence in the potting shed, had struck a note that was not quite right. It was rather like a piece of music played in the wrong key, perfectly executed but somehow discordant. Miss Marple had long ago learned to pay attention to such small discordances. In her experience, they were often the first indication that something was not as it appeared, that beneath the smooth surface of daily life, currents were moving that would eventually demand attention. Whether those currents would prove significant remained to be seen, but Miss Marple made a mental note of the conversation and of the particular way Mrs. Fawcett had smiled when speaking of her excellent memory and its tricks. The evening remained fine, and Miss Marple sat in her own modest garden as twilight gathered, reflecting that tomorrow's opening might prove more interesting than a simple display of roses and herbaceous borders. Gardens, after all, were places where things were planted, nurtured, and and sometimes concealed, and she had noticed over the years that the most carefully tended gardens were not always the ones that held the fewest secrets. Chapter 2: Visitors Who Knew Their Place. Saturday morning brought the sort of weather that justified all the hopeful planning of the preceding week. The sky held a few high clouds that served only to prevent the sunshine from becoming oppressive, and there was a light breeze that would, Miss Marple reflected as she dressed for the afternoon, make standing about in a garden a positive pleasure rather than an endurance test. The charity opening was scheduled to begin at 2:30, a time carefully chosen to allow guests to complete their luncheons without hurry, whilst ensuring sufficient daylight for a proper appreciation of the boarders. Miss Marple, who had lived long enough to recognise the significance of such decisions, understood that Mrs. Fawcett was a woman who left nothing to chance. She herself arrived at Rosebery Cottage at 20 minutes to 3, having judged that to appear too promptly might suggest over-eagerness, whilst to arrive too late might deprive her of the opportunity to observe the initial gatherings and arrangements. The gate stood open, and a hand-lettered sign directed visitors along a gravel path that curved around the side of the house. Already there were voices audible from the garden, the pleasant murmur of people being admirably behaved in pleasant surroundings. The garden, when it came into view, fully justified its reputation. Miss Marple paused for a moment to take in the scene. The space had been arranged with an understanding of perspective and proportion that suggested genuine taste rather than mere adherence to fashion. A central lawn, immaculately maintained, was bordered by deep beds where roses predominated but did not overwhelm. Stone paths wound between sections, creating natural routes for visitors to follow, whilst appearing entirely uncontrived. Beyond the formal areas, the garden extended into what appeared to be a more naturalistic arrangement of shrubs and small trees, offering both variety and a sense of privacy. Mrs. Fawcett stood near a trestle table that had been set up beneath a venerable oak tree, where contributions for the tea were being arranged. She wore a dress of pale blue linen that was both elegant and practical, and her manner combined graciousness with the quiet authority of a hostess who knows precisely how things ought to proceed. As guests approached, she greeted each with a few words that seemed simultaneously warm and perfectly measured, managing to convey welcome without encouraging lengthy conversation that might delay the smooth movement of arrivals. Miss Marple observed that the guests were arriving in small groups, most of them known to one another, and moving with the ease of people who understood their place in the village hierarchy. There was Mrs. Thornton with her sister from the next village, both dressed in their Sunday best and clearly delighted to have secured invitations. The vicar appeared with his wife, were welcomed with particular warmth by Mrs. Fawcett, and proceeded into the garden with the slightly self-conscious dignity of people aware they represented the church. Haydock arrived as his wife was unwell, and was directed toward the roses with the suggestion that he might particularly appreciate a new variety Mrs. Fawcett had recently acquired. Certain paths through the garden, Miss Marple noticed, seemed to be quietly encouraged, whilst others were subtly bypassed. When Mrs. Price made as though to wander toward a section near the potting shed, Mrs. Fawcett gently suggested that the best of the roses were to be found in quite the opposite direction, and Mrs. Price, with the amenability of someone who recognised guidance when it was offered, altered her course accordingly. Miss Marple had just accepted a cup of tea from a young woman assisting at the table when Mrs. Peake arrived. Mrs. Peake was a woman of 60 or thereabouts, a prominent member of various village committees, and possessed of that particular variety of sharp-eyedness that missed very little of what occurred within her sphere of observation. She had a talent for appearing to speak generally, whilst ensuring her remarks reached precisely the ears for which they were intended. "What a lovely afternoon for it," Mrs. Peake announced, accepting her own tea with a gracious nod. "And how fortunate that everything has come together so smoothly. Though of course with Mrs. Fawcett at the helm one expects nothing less. She has always been so particular about arrangements." Mrs. Fawcett acknowledged this compliment with a slight inclination of her head, and Mrs. Peake continued, her gaze moving thoughtfully about the garden. "I understand Miss Allen has been assisting with preparations," she observed, in a tone that managed to be both pleasant and faintly questioning. "How good of her to give her time, though I confess I do sometimes wonder whether it is altogether wise to entrust certain responsibilities to those who are not, shall we say, accustomed to handling matters of a delicate nature." There was a brief pause during which Miss Marple noted that several nearby conversations seemed to falter slightly, as though people were listening whilst pretending not to do so. Mrs. Fawcett's expression remained perfectly composed. "Miss Allen has been most helpful," she replied, with the sort of measured warmth that neither confirmed nor denied any particular interpretation. "One is always grateful for willing hands, though naturally one must take care that willing hands understand what is required of them." It was at this moment that Marjorie Allen herself appeared from the direction of the house, carrying a large jug of lemonade. She was a thin woman of middle height, dressed in a serviceable brown frock that suggested practicality rather than vanity. Her face, which in repose might have been pleasant, wore an expression of anxious attentiveness, the look of someone determined to be useful and fearful of making errors. As she approached the tea table, the small group that had gathered there seemed to shift almost imperceptibly, making room for her whilst somehow emphasizing that room was being made. Mrs. Peake's greeting was perfectly courteous, as was Mrs. Fawcett's thanks for the lemonade, but there was something in the quality of the exchange that suggested Miss Allen had become, quite suddenly, and perhaps quite unfairly, conspicuous in a way she had not been conspicuous before. "I do hope I haven't kept you waiting," Miss Allen said, setting down the jug with care. "I wanted to ensure it was properly chilled." "Not at all," Mrs. Fawcett assured her. "You have been most thoughtful, though perhaps you might check that the gate at the far end remains fastened. I should not like visitors to wander into the lane by accident." It was a reasonable request, and Miss Allen departed to fulfil it with the same anxious efficiency she had brought to the lemonade. Once she was out of earshot, Mrs. Peake remarked, in a tone of general reflection rather than specific accusation, that it was unfortunate when trust was placed in hands that could not quite manage what was asked of them. "The ledger business, I suppose you mean," said Mrs. Thornton's sister, who was visiting and therefore felt entitled to ask direct questions. "Has it been found?" Mrs. Fawcett's expression suggested mild surprise that the matter had become a subject of discussion. "I'm sure it will turn up in due course. These small misplacements happen to everyone. I dare say I set it down somewhere unusual and have forgotten." "Or perhaps," Mrs. Peake suggested delicately, "it was set down by someone whose mind was on other matters and who did not quite realise the importance of keeping track of such things." Miss Marple, sipping her tea and observing a particularly fine climbing rose nearby, reflected that accusations delivered in the subjunctive and without direct reference to persons were often more damaging than frank statements of fact. Poor Miss Allen, whether guilty of carelessness or not, was being made to bear the weight of uncertainty, and that weight was being applied with considerable skill. What struck Miss Marple as particularly noteworthy was not the suggestion itself, but Mrs. Fawcett's response to it. Her concern appeared carefully calibrated, neither excessive nor entirely absent. She did not rush to Miss Allen's defence, nor did she actively encourage suspicion, but permitted it to settle where it would, like seeds finding their own places in prepared soil. The afternoon continued in its orderly fashion, with guests moving along the encouraged paths and admiring what they were meant to admire. But Miss Marple, who understood a great deal about gardens and rather more about human nature, found herself paying particular attention to what was being cultivated beneath the surface of courtesy and charitable intent. Chapter 3. Miss Marple Observes a Withheld Smile. The afternoon progressed with the gentle rhythm characteristic of such events, where people moved between admiring the plantings and engaging in the sort of conversation that required neither great thought nor complete inattention. Miss Marple found herself standing near a border of delphiniums, their tall spires of blue providing a backdrop that was both restful and pleasingly vertical in a garden that favoured horizontal sweep. She was not, however, attending solely to the delphiniums. Her position afforded an excellent view of the central lawn, where Mrs. Fawcett had paused to speak with Thomas Reed, who had arrived some minutes earlier, looking rather warm and carrying a Panama hat that suggested he had walked from his cottage on the far side of the village. Mr. Reed was a man of perhaps 65, with the slightly stooped posture of someone who had spent many years bending over pupils' work. His retirement from the village school had occurred 5 years previously, and he had adapted to it with the air of someone who was not entirely certain what to do with unexpected leisure. He involved himself in various village activities with earnest goodwill, though there was about him a persistent unease, as though he feared being thought intrusive or presumptuous. It was the manner, Miss Marple reflected, of a man who had been accustomed to authority in a limited sphere and was now uncertain of his standing outside it. He was speaking to Mrs. Fawcett with the diffidence characteristic of his approach to social encounters, gesturing occasionally toward the garden, as though seeking something specific to praise. Mrs. Fawcett listened with the attentiveness of a good hostess, her head inclined slightly, her expression suggesting both interest and a certain reserve that discouraged excessive familiarity. Miss Marple, whose hearing remained acute despite her years, caught fragments of their conversation. Mr. Reed was offering assistance of some kind. His tone hopeful but not insistent. Something about the potting shed, if she heard correctly, and perhaps some confusion regarding tools or materials that might need arranging. "You are very kind, Mr. Reed," Mrs. Fawcett replied, her voice carrying clearly across the lawn. "But I believe everything is well in hand. Miss Allen has been most thorough in tidying things, and I should not wish to trouble you with what has already been completed." Her smile as she spoke was everything one might expect from a gracious hostess declining an offer that was well meant but unnecessary. It conveyed gratitude without obligation, warmth without encouragement. And yet, as Miss Marple watched with the careful attention she brought to such matters, she observed that the smile faded a moment too quickly once Mr. Reed had nodded his acceptance and turned to admire the delphiniums himself. It was a small thing, scarcely worth noting under ordinary circumstances. Smiles fade, after all, when there is no longer occasion for them, but there was something in the quality of this particular fading, a sense not of natural conclusion but of deliberate withdrawal that caught Miss Marple's notice. It was rather like watching a door close with the faintest suggestion that it had been closed with purpose rather than simply allowed to swing shut. Mr. Reed, seemingly satisfied with his exchange, moved away toward the tea table, and Mrs. Fawcett remained where she was for a moment, her gaze following him with an expression that might have been thoughtful or might have been calculating. It was difficult to say with certainty, and Miss Marple was too experienced to leap to conclusions based on ambiguous evidence. But she filed the observation away with that mental precision she had cultivated over many years of watching people navigate the small complexities of village life. What happened next was even more instructive. Marjorie Allen, having apparently completed her errand regarding the gate, approached Mrs. Fawcett with a question about the arrangement of chairs for those guests who might prefer to sit. It was a practical inquiry, the sort that might arise naturally in the course of any garden party, and Miss Allen asked it with the anxious efficiency that appeared to characterize her approach to all tasks. But as she drew near, something shifted in the atmosphere of the lawn. Mrs. Fawcett, who had been standing in apparent contemplation, turned to greet Miss Allen with a cordiality that was perfectly correct but somehow complete in itself, requiring no elaboration. And then, quite distinctly, the conversation that had been occurring between Mrs. Fawcett and the vicar's wife, who had joined her moments before Miss Allen's arrival, simply paused. It was not an awkward pause, precisely, nor was it pointed enough to constitute deliberate rudeness. It was more subtle than that, a brief suspension of discourse that suggested Miss Allen's presence had introduced something that required adjustment, like a wrong note in a familiar melody that makes the listener hesitate before the music continues. Miss Allen, to her credit, did not appear to notice, or perhaps had grown so accustomed to such pauses that she no longer registered them as significant. She explained about the chairs, received Mrs. Fawcett's instructions, and departed to fulfill them with the same determined helpfulness she had shown earlier. Once she was beyond earshot, the vicar's wife resumed her previous topic, something to do with the arrangements for Sunday's flowers, and the conversation flowed again, as though it had never been interrupted. But Miss Marple, who had observed the entire sequence from her position by the delphiniums, reflected that pauses in conversation were often more revealing than the words that surrounded them. She thought of a parallel from her own experience, though it took a moment to locate it precisely in her memory. Yes, there had been a young maid in the household of her friend Lady Evesham many years ago who had been suspected of appropriating small items of jewellery. Nothing had been proven, and the girl had not been dismissed outright, but there had developed around her a quality of pause, a hesitation in the manner people spoke when she entered a room, that had effectively marked her as guilty long before any evidence was produced. The girl had eventually left of her own accord, unable to bear the weight of unspoken accusation, and the jewellery had later been found in the possession of a nephew visiting from London. But by then, of course, the damage had been done. Miss Marple was not prepared to draw direct parallels between that unfortunate situation and the present circumstances surrounding Miss Allen. But she could not help noticing that a similar quality of pause was beginning to attach itself to the woman, a subtle but unmistakable sense that her presence introduced complications that had not existed before. She wondered, as she moved slowly along the border toward a particularly fine display of lupins, whether Mrs. Fawcett was aware of what was being created. Surely a woman of her intelligence and social experience must recognise the power of these small gestures, the way a smile withheld or a conversation paused could shape perception as effectively as any direct statement. The question Miss Marple supposed was whether such recognition implied intention, or whether one could create such effects unconsciously through habits of manner too deeply ingrained to be examined. It was, she reflected, sipping the last of her tea and setting the cup carefully on a nearby bench, a question worth considering. Gardens required constant attention if they were not to grow wild, and the same might be said of reputations. Someone was doing a great deal of careful tending in both regards, and Miss Marple found herself increasingly curious about what precisely was being cultivated and what was being quietly uprooted to make room for it. Chapter 4, A Compliment with an Edge. By 4 o'clock, the garden party had reached that point of gentle saturation where most guests had completed their circuit of the grounds at least once, and were now engaged in the pleasant task of revisiting particular favourites or settling into conversations that required no movement beyond the occasional shift of position to accommodate a newcomer to the group. Miss Marple found herself standing with a small gathering near the rose beds that formed the garden's centrepiece. These had been arranged in a formal pattern that somehow avoided rigidity, each variety given sufficient space to display its particular character, whilst contributing to the overall harmony. It was the sort of planting that looked effortless but revealed, to an experienced eye, countless hours of planning and adjustment. "I do think," Mrs. Thornton was saying, "that this is precisely what a garden ought to be. Nothing overdone, nothing jarring, just perfect balance." Her sister agreed enthusiastically, and Dr. Haydock, who had rejoined the group after making his rounds of the borders, observed that balance was indeed the essential quality. "One sees gardens that are all spectacle," he remarked, "where every plant seems to be competing for attention. But here, everything knows its place. There's a discipline to it that's rather admirable." Miss Marple noted that discipline was an interesting word to choose, though she suspected Dr. Haydock had meant it in purely horticultural terms. Nevertheless, it captured something essential about the garden, and perhaps about its creator. Mrs. Fawcett was clearly a woman who valued order, who understood that beauty could emerge from restraint, and who possessed the strength of will to maintain standards even when easier approaches might have sufficed. Mrs. Peake, who had been examining a particularly fine pale yellow rose, turned back to the group with the air of someone about to deliver a pronouncement. "Mrs. Fawcett has always had standards," she announced, in that tone of warm approval that somehow contained within it the suggestion that not everyone could make such a claim. "It's one of the things we most value about her. Standards in a garden, standards in her household, standards in her dealings with parish affairs. One always knows that things will be done properly when Mrs. Fawcett is involved." There was a murmur of agreement from the assembled company, and Mrs. Peake continued, her gaze moving thoughtfully across the garden to where Mrs. Fawcett herself was visible in conversation with the vicar. "Of course," she added, and there was something in the addition that made Miss Marple pay particular attention, "standards can be difficult to maintain without vigilance. One cannot simply establish them and then assume they will persist of their own accord. There must be constant attention, constant care to ensure that nothing slips, that responsibilities are properly understood and properly discharged. She said this in a general reflective manner, as though musing aloud about abstract principles rather than making reference to any specific situation. But Miss Marple, who had spent a lifetime observing the ways in which people communicated uncomfortable truths through the medium of apparent generalities, understood that there was nothing abstract about the observation. It was aimed as surely as an arrow is aimed at a target, though the aim was disguised by the pleasant tone and the philosophical wrapper. What made the moment particularly instructive was that Marjorie Allen had, at precisely that juncture, emerged from behind a hedge of lavender, where she had apparently been attending to some small task. She was near enough to hear Mrs. Peake's remarks, though whether she had been near enough to hear the entire conversation was impossible to determine. Miss Allen's face, which had borne its usual expression of anxious competence, coloured slightly. It was not a dramatic flush, nothing that would necessarily attract notice from someone not paying attention, but Miss Marple saw it clearly. The woman had heard enough to understand that she was, however indirectly, being referenced, and the knowledge had touched something sensitive. She hesitated for a moment, as though uncertain whether to approach the group or to retreat to some other part of the garden. In that hesitation, Miss Marple read a painful awareness of position, a recognition that one's presence might not be entirely welcome, combined with a stubborn determination not to be driven away by mere implication. It was the pause of someone who has been made to feel small but refuses to acknowledge defeat. In the end, Miss Allen moved forward, though not directly toward the group by the roses. Instead, she approached Mrs. Thornton's sister with a question about whether more tea was required at the table, a practical inquiry that established her right to be present whilst avoiding any appearance of forcing herself into a conversation where she had not been invited. Mrs. Thornton's sister, who was a kind woman unaware of the undercurrent swirling about, thanked her warmly and said that the tea situation appeared to be well managed. Miss Allen nodded, accepted this information with the same determined efficiency she brought to everything, and moved on toward the house, her posture very straight, and her step perhaps slightly quicker than strictly necessary. Once she was out of earshot, Mrs. Peake resumed her observations, though she had the good taste not to make any direct reference to Miss Allen's presence or departure. Instead, she spoke again of standards and their maintenance, of the importance of trust in any communal endeavour, and of how regrettable it was when that trust proved to have been misplaced. "The ledger business, for instance," she said, and now the arrow was no longer disguised at all, "is exactly the sort of situation that arises when responsibilities are given to those who lack the training or temperament to handle them properly. I'm quite certain dear Mrs. Fawcett meant well in accepting assistance, but one must be realistic about capabilities. Not everyone is suited to every task, and sometimes kindness in delegation can lead to unfortunate consequences." Dr. Haydock, who was a sensible man with little patience for village intrigue, suggested mildly that the ledger had likely been set down somewhere and would turn up in due course. These things generally did, in his experience. Perhaps, Mrs. Peake conceded, though her tone suggested she held a different view. Though one does wonder where it might have been set down, and by whom, and whether the setting down was merely careless or reflected some deeper confusion about what ought to be kept secure and what might be treated casually. Miss Marple listened to this exchange with the careful neutrality she maintained when observing situations that had not yet revealed their full shape. What struck her particularly was the manner in which the ledger was being discussed. It was mentioned obliquely, always with qualifications and careful phrasing, never with direct accusation. And yet, with each oblique mention, the implication grew stronger that something improper had occurred, and that Miss Allen bore responsibility for it. The interesting question, Miss Marple reflected, as the conversation drifted toward other topics, was why this particular approach had been chosen. If Mrs. Fawcett genuinely believed Miss Allen had mishandled the ledger, whether through carelessness or intent, it would be simple enough to say so directly and ask for its return or replacement. That she had not done so, and that instead this atmosphere of careful implication was being maintained and even encouraged, suggested that the ledger itself might be less important than the cloud of suspicion gathering around Miss Allen. Miss Marple had known situations before where guilt was assigned not because evidence demanded it, but because convenience required it. A scapegoat, carefully selected and quietly designated, could serve purposes that had nothing to do with actual wrongdoing and everything to do with the protection of reputations or the deflection of scrutiny from matters better left unexamined. Whether that was the case here remained to be determined. But as she made her way slowly back toward the tea table, accepting compliments on the garden from various acquaintances, and maintaining the pleasant, slightly vague demeanour of an elderly lady enjoying a social afternoon, Miss Marple was paying very close attention indeed to the ways in which standards were being maintained, vigilance was being exercised, and blame was being distributed in this most carefully tended of gardens. Chapter 5: The Notebook Kept Out of Sight. The garden party continued until 5:30, by which time the shadows had begun to lengthen in that particular way that suggests evening is approaching without having quite arrived. Guests departed in the same orderly fashion in which they had come, expressing their thanks and admiration with the warmth appropriate to a successful charitable event. The nursing fund had benefited considerably, and Mrs. Fawcett accepted congratulations on the afternoon's success with her characteristic grace. Miss Marple, who had no pressing engagements and found the walk home pleasant at this hour, was among the last to leave. She had just retrieved her handbag from the hall table inside Rosebery Cottage when she encountered Thomas Reed, who appeared to have lingered for similar reasons, or perhaps from an uncertainty about when departure became appropriate rather than premature. They walked together as far as the high street, engaging in the sort of companionable conversation that requires little effort and offers mutual comfort to those who find themselves travelling the same route. Mr. Reed spoke appreciatively of the garden, remarked on the fine weather, and expressed hope that the nursing fund would put the contributions to good use. It was only as they reached the corner by the post office that he ventured onto less neutral ground. "I confess," he said, with the diffidence that characterised most of his utterances, "that I felt somewhat concerned by the atmosphere this afternoon. There seemed to be, well, perhaps I am imagining things, but there seemed to be a certain tension regarding Miss Allen." Miss Marple, who had been considering whether to raise this very subject herself, expressed interest in his observations. Mr. Reed, encouraged by this receptiveness, continued with increasing frankness. "The business of the ledger, you understand. I gather there has been some suggestion that Miss Allen might have misplaced it, or, well, one hesitates to put it more strongly than that. But I confess I find the whole matter rather troubling. Miss Allen has always struck me as a conscientious person, perhaps overly anxious to please, but hardly careless with the responsibilities entrusted to her." He paused, and Miss Marple waited with the patience she brought to conversations that were working their way towards significance through circuitous routes. "The thing is," Mr. Reed said at last, "I happened to be passing Rosebery Cottage on Thursday evening. I had been to the library, you see, and my route home takes me along that road. And I noticed Miss Allen leaving by the garden gate. She appeared quite composed, nothing furtive or hurried about her manner. Indeed, she smiled and nodded to me as we passed. If she had just done something improper with the ledger, I should think she would have shown some sign of it." This was an interesting observation, and Miss Marple encouraged him to continue. Had he noticed anything else about the evening? Had there been other visitors to the cottage? Mr. Reed considered carefully. "Mrs. Fawcett was working in the garden. I could see her through the hedge. She appeared to be attending to something near the potting shed, though I did not like to stare. And I believe I saw Mrs. Peake's motor car parked a little way up the road, though I cannot be certain it was hers. Several people in the village have similar vehicles." They had reached the point where their paths diverged, and they parted with mutual expressions of goodwill. But the conversation had given Miss Marple a great deal to think about, and she walked the remaining distance to her own cottage, with her mind working over the various pieces of information she had gathered. That evening, after a light supper, Miss Marple received a visit from an unexpected quarter. Lady Bantry, her old friend Dolly, appeared at the door with the slightly conspiratorial air of someone bearing intelligence that might prove interesting. "I know it's rather late for calling," Dolly said, settling herself into Miss Marple's most comfortable chair with the ease of long friendship, "but I've just come from the Richardsons, and Mrs. Richardson mentioned something that I thought you ought to hear." Miss Marple poured tea and waited, knowing that Dolly would arrive at her point in her own time, and that hurrying her would only prolong the journey. "It concerns that ledger everyone's been whispering about," Dolly continued. "Apparently it's not just a simple record of donations and expenses. Mrs. Richardson's sister serves on the district committee, and she mentioned, in strictest confidence of course, that Mrs. Fawcett has been keeping track of rather more than charitable contributions." She paused for effect, and Miss Marple obliged by expressing polite curiosity. "It seems," Dolly said, lowering her voice though they were quite alone, "that the ledger includes records of various adjustments made over the years, quiet assistance given to families during difficult periods, small amounts redirected from general funds to specific cases of need, that sort of thing. All perfectly well-intentioned, I'm sure, but not precisely the sort of thing that would stand up to rigorous scrutiny if anyone chose to examine the accounts too closely." Miss Marple absorbed this information thoughtfully. "And Mrs. Fawcett managed these adjustments personally?" "Oh yes. Apparently she's been doing it for years, always discreetly, always with the best of intentions. Helping families who couldn't quite manage, you see, without making a fuss about it or requiring them to go through official channels that might be embarrassing. Everyone speaks very highly of her compassion." "I see," Miss Marple said slowly. "And this ledger would contain records of all these private arrangements." "Precisely. Which is why I suppose its disappearance might be considered rather awkward, though Mrs. Richardson's sister seemed to think it hadn't actually disappeared at all. She had the impression that Mrs. Fawcett had put it somewhere safe herself, out of concern that it might be examined during the garden party. This cast the entire situation in a rather different light. Miss Marple refilled their teacups and considered the implications. If the ledger had not been misplaced but deliberately concealed, and if that concealment was motivated by concern about the scrutiny its contents might invite, then the question became not where the ledger was, but why Mrs. Fawcett had chosen to create the impression that it had been lost through someone else's carelessness. "I wonder," Miss Marple said, more to herself than to Dolly, "why safety should require concealment from one's own charitable committee. If the adjustments were made in good faith, surely they could be explained and defended." "Well," Dolly replied practically, "you know how people can be. What looks like charitable discretion to some might look like irregular accounting to others, particularly if anyone had a mind to make trouble. And there's always someone with a mind to make trouble, isn't there?" Miss Marple agreed that this was unfortunately true. She thought of the various parish committees and charitable boards she had observed over the years, and reflected that the line between compassionate flexibility and procedural irregularity could sometimes be very fine indeed, particularly when examined by those who valued procedure above compassion. After Dolly had departed, Miss Marple sat for some time in her chair by the window, watching the last light fade from the sky. The picture that was emerging was more complex than a simple matter of a misplaced notebook. If the ledger was safe, as seemed increasingly likely, then its supposed loss served some other purpose. And if that purpose involved allowing suspicion to settle on Marjorie Allen, then one had to ask what was being protected by that misdirection, and whether the protection was worth the cost of an innocent woman's reputation. Gardens, Miss Marple reflected, required both cultivation and concealment. Some plants thrived in sunlight, whilst others preferred shade. And some things, apparently, were planted specifically in order to hide what lay beneath them, growing over inconvenient truths as effectively as ivy covers old walls. The question was whether what lay beneath deserved to remain hidden, or whether it was time for a little judicious weeding to reveal what had been so carefully obscured. Chapter 6. An errand that was remembered wrong. Sunday brought with it the usual rhythms of village life. The church bells rang for morning service, and the congregation assembled with that mixture of piety and social awareness that characterised such gatherings. Miss Marple attended, as she generally did, and noted that Mrs. Fawcett was present in her customary pew, looking composed and rather handsome in a dark blue ensemble that suggested both respectability and restraint. Marjorie Allen was also present, though she sat further back than usual and left immediately after the final hymn without pausing for the conversations that typically occurred on the church steps. Miss Marple observed this departure with interest, recognising in it the behaviour of someone who has become uncomfortably aware of being discussed and wishes to avoid providing further material for speculation. After the service, the usual groups formed outside the church, and the usual topics were raised and considered. The success of Saturday's garden party featured prominently, with particular praise reserved for the beauty of the roses and the generosity of the proceeds. Mrs. Fawcett accepted these compliments with her characteristic grace, though Miss Marple thought she detected a certain weariness beneath the composure, as though the maintenance of appearances had become more taxing than usual. It was during one of these conversations, while Miss Marple stood within earshot, though not quite part of the immediate circle, that Mrs. Fawcett made a remark that proved illuminating. "I must confess," she said to Mrs. Thornton and the vicar's wife, "that I felt somewhat concerned yesterday about poor Miss Allen. She seemed rather distracted, and I do hope I did not ask too much of her. I particularly recall sending her to the potting shed quite late in the afternoon to fetch some twine I needed for staking a delphinium that had begun to lean. She was gone rather longer than I expected, and I wondered afterward whether I should have been more specific about which drawer contained the twine." It was said with apparent concern, the tone of someone reviewing the day's events and worried that she might have inadvertently added to another's difficulties. But Miss Marple, whose attention had sharpened considerably at the mention of the potting shed, noted the specific detail about timing. Late in the afternoon, Mrs. Fawcett had said, when, presumably, most of the guests would have been occupied elsewhere in the garden, and Miss Allen would have been alone in the shed where the ledger had last been seen. Mrs. Thornton murmured something sympathetic about the challenges of managing helpers, and the conversation moved to other topics. But Miss Marple remained thoughtful, turning over in her mind the implications of what she had just heard. It was not the errand itself that troubled her, but the care with which its timing had been specified. On Monday morning, Miss Marple had occasion to visit the draper's shop on the High Street, where she encountered Thomas Reed examining a display of handkerchiefs with the air of someone who is not entirely certain what he is looking for, but feels he ought to be looking for something. After the usual pleasantries had been exchanged, and Mr. Reed had selected 3 handkerchiefs of conservative design, they walked out together into the sunlight. "I wonder," Miss Marple said, with the casual air of someone making idle conversation, "whether you remained at the garden party on Saturday until the very end? I left rather late myself, but I had the impression some guests stayed even longer." Mr. Reed considered this carefully. "I stayed until perhaps 5:15, he replied. "I should have left earlier, I suppose, but I found the garden so restful that I rather lost track of time. I spent a good while sitting on the bench near the herbaceous border, just watching the light change." "How pleasant," Miss Marple observed. "Did you notice Miss Allen during that time? I ask only because I overheard Mrs. Fawcett expressing concern that she might have overburdened the poor woman with errands." "Ah, yes." Mr. Reed's expression suggested he was working through his recollections with care. "Miss Allen was certainly busy throughout the afternoon. I particularly remember seeing her carrying that large jug of lemonade. That must have been about 3:00 or shortly after. And then later, perhaps around 3:30, I noticed Mrs. Fawcett speaking with her near the potting shed. Mrs. Fawcett appeared to be giving instructions of some sort, and Miss Allen went into the shed. She emerged a few minutes later with a ball of twine, which she took to Mrs. Fawcett, who was working with the delphiniums. Miss Marple's interest intensified, though she maintained her pleasant, rather vague expression. 3:30, you say? Not later than that?" "I'm quite certain," Mr. Reed replied, with more confidence than he usually displayed. "I had looked at my pocket watch just before, as I was trying to decide whether it would be rude to leave before 4 o'clock. And I remember thinking that Miss Allen was being very helpful, attending to all these small tasks while managing to remain cheerful about it. This was most interesting. Mrs. Fawcett's account had placed the errand late in the afternoon, implying a time when Miss Allen might have been alone in the shed. But Mr. Reed recalled it occurring at 3:30, when the garden party was still in full swing, and numerous witnesses would have been present. It was a discrepancy that might mean nothing. Memories were fallible after all, and times could easily become confused. But it might also mean a great deal, particularly if one party had reason to prefer one version of events over another. Miss Marple thanked Mr. Reed for his company and continued homeward, her mind working through the implications. That evening she had a visitor in the form of Marjorie Allen herself, who appeared at the door looking pale and determined, as though she had been gathering her courage for some time before finally acting upon it. "I hope you will forgive the intrusion, Miss Marple," she began, once she had been settled with tea in the sitting room. "But I find myself in a most uncomfortable position, and I hardly know whom to turn to. You've always been so kind, and I thought perhaps you might advise me." Miss Marple assured her that she was welcome and waited for the woman to find her words. "It concerns the afternoon of the garden party," Miss Allen continued, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "Mrs. Fawcett has mentioned, not to me directly, you understand, but I have heard from others, that she asked me to fetch twine from the potting shed quite late in the day, and that I was there for some time unobserved. But Miss Marple, that is not how I remember it at all." She paused, struggling with the difficulty of contradicting someone of Mrs. Fawcett's standing. "I did fetch twine from the shed, certainly, but it was much earlier, around 3:30, and there were people all about. Mr. Reed was sitting on the nearby bench. I saw him quite clearly, and Mrs. Fawcett was with me when I entered the shed. She pointed out which drawer contained the twine, and I brought it directly to her. I could not have been in there more than 2 or 3 minutes." Miss Marple listened with close attention. "And you are quite certain of the timing?" "Absolutely certain, someone," Miss Allen replied, with a firmness born of accuracy rather than defiance. "I know it was 3:30 because I had been worried about whether the lemonade would remain cold enough, and I had checked the clock in the hall just beforehand to see how much longer the party would continue." "And did you return to the potting shed later in the afternoon?" "No, Miss Marple, I had no reason to do so. After the twine errand, I was occupied with clearing away used tea things and assisting guests who were preparing to leave. I was never alone in that part of the garden." Miss Marple reflected on this account, which aligned precisely with Thomas Reed's recollection, and differed significantly from Mrs. Fawcett's version. The question was not merely which account was accurate, but why the discrepancy existed. Memory could indeed play tricks, but it seemed unlikely that both Miss Allen and Mr. Reed would independently recall the same incorrect timing with such specificity. "You must not let this trouble you unduly," Miss Marple said gently, though she understood this was easier to say than to accomplish. "The truth of what occurred will become clear in time. These things generally do." After Miss Allen had departed, grateful for the hearing if not entirely comforted, Miss Marple sat for some time considering how easily time could be reshaped when memory served convenience, and how difficult it became to defend oneself when respectable witnesses chose to remember events in ways that cast suspicion rather than dispelled it. Chapter 7. What the Roses Had Replaced. Tuesday afternoon found Miss Marple in her own garden, attending to some light weeding that had been neglected during the previous week's unsettled weather. The work was pleasant rather than arduous, requiring just enough attention to be satisfying whilst leaving the mind free to wander over other matters, and Miss Marple's mind had of late been wandering quite extensively over the question of Mrs. Fawcett's garden and the various mysteries that seemed to have taken root there alongside the more conventional plantings. She was considering whether to tackle a particularly persistent dandelion when she was interrupted by the arrival of the vicar's wife, Mrs. Clement, who appeared at the garden gate with an air of mild agitation that suggested news requiring immediate sharing. "I do hope I'm not disturbing you, Miss Marple," she began, though she clearly hoped no such thing. But I've just come from visiting old Mrs. Hartley, you know. She's been poorly with her hip, and she mentioned something rather curious that I thought you might find interesting." Miss Marple set aside her trowel and invited Mrs. Clement to sit on the bench beneath the apple tree, where they might converse comfortably. Once settled, Mrs. Clement launched into her narrative with the enthusiasm of someone who has been holding information in check and is relieved to release it. "Mrs. Hartley's nephew, you see, does gardening work for several households in the village, Mrs. Fawcett's among them, and he mentioned to his aunt that he had been asked to do rather a lot of replanting at Rosebery Cottage last week, just before the garden opening. Apparently Mrs. Fawcett decided quite suddenly that she wanted a new rose bed where there had previously been some sort of seating arrangement." Miss Marple expressed polite interest, and Mrs. Clement continued with increasing animation. "The curious thing is the timing. According to young Hartley, the work was done on Wednesday and Thursday, mere days before the party. He said Mrs. Fawcett was very particular about how it should be accomplished, and that everything from the old arrangement — there had been a small wooden bench there apparently with some low plantings around it — had to be completely removed and the bed established in its place. He found it rather odd doing such major work so close to an important event, but of course one doesn't question Mrs. Fawcett." "No, indeed," Miss Marple murmured. "And did Mrs. Fawcett explain her reasons for the change?" "Only that she felt the symmetry of the garden required adjustment. Young Hartley said she mentioned something about the bench having served its purpose and being no longer needed. He assumed she meant aesthetically, though he did think the old arrangement had been rather charming in its way." After Mrs. Clement had departed to continue her rounds of parish visiting, Miss Marple remained on her bench, thinking about benches and their purposes. A bench in a garden was typically placed for rest and contemplation, positioned to take advantage of a pleasant view or a shaded spot. But a bench could serve other purposes as well. It could provide a place for private conversations, for reviewing papers that one preferred not to review indoors where household staff might observe, for conducting the small, discreet transactions that formed part of the administrative life of someone managing charitable funds with perhaps more flexibility than official procedures might strictly allow. The following morning, Miss Marple found an opportunity to walk past Rosebery Cottage on her way to call on Lady Bantry. The garden was visible from the road, and she paused to admire the roses that had been so universally praised during Saturday's party. The new bed that Mrs. Clement had mentioned was indeed handsome, planted with a variety of pink and cream roses that complemented the older plantings nearby. To an ordinary observer it appeared entirely natural, as though it had always been part of the garden's design, but Miss Marple, whose observational skills were far from ordinary, noticed something that others might have overlooked. The soil in the new bed, though neatly raked and mulched, had a different quality from that in the surrounding areas. It was less settled, lacking the compacted appearance that comes from months or years of establishment. And here and there, where the mulch had shifted slightly, she could see that the earth beneath had been recently disturbed, turned and amended in ways that suggested something substantial had been removed from beneath it. She was contemplating this observation when Mrs. Fawcett herself appeared from around the side of the house, carrying a basket of cut flowers. She greeted Miss Marple with her usual cordiality and invited her to step through the gate for a closer look at the garden, now that it was free from the crowds that had filled it on Saturday. Miss Marple accepted, and they walked together along the paths, discussing the various plantings with the shared appreciation of those who understood gardens as more than merely decorative spaces. When they reached the new rose bed, Mrs. Fawcett paused with evident satisfaction. "I'm particularly pleased with how this has turned out," she said. "It was rather a last-minute decision, but I felt the symmetry required it. There had been a bench here previously, but it rather interrupted the flow of the borders. It must have been a considerable undertaking so close to the party," Miss Marple observed mildly. "Oh, young Hartley is very efficient, and once I had decided the change was necessary, it seemed best to accomplish it immediately rather than leave it half done." Mrs. Fawcett bent to adjust a stake supporting one of the roses. The bench had become rather shabby in any case, and I found I was using it less and less. There are other places to sit after all, and this section of the garden benefits from being kept entirely to plantings. Miss Marple made an appreciative sound, but she was thinking about what the bench had been used for when it was being used. Lady Bantry's intelligence suggested that Mrs. Fawcett had sometimes reviewed records in her garden, managing her charitable adjustments in private moments away from the formality of indoor business. A bench tucked away from the main paths, partially screened by plantings, would have served that purpose admirably. "I imagine," Miss Marple said thoughtfully, "that it must have been a pleasant spot for reviewing papers and such on fine days. Rather more agreeable than being confined indoors." Something flickered briefly in Mrs. Fawcett's expression, too quick to be read with certainty but suggestive of recognition that the remark had touched on something significant. But her response was smooth and untroubled. "I occasionally brought correspondence out here, certainly, but as I say, one adapts. There are other arrangements that serve equally well." She straightened from her examination of the rose stake and smiled with perfect composure. "Shall we continue toward the herbaceous border? The delphiniums are at their peak just now." They moved on, and the conversation shifted to safer topics. But Miss Marple, walking slowly along the carefully tended paths, reflected that what had been removed from the garden was not merely a shabby bench requiring replacement. What had been removed quite deliberately, and with considerable effort given the timing, was a physical location associated with the management of those discreet adjustments that Mrs. Fawcett had made over the years. One might ask why such removal had been necessary. After all, a bench was merely a bench, and its presence or absence could hardly affect the contents of a ledger or the nature of the transactions recorded within it. But Miss Marple understood that sometimes physical spaces became connected in people's minds with specific activities, and that removing the space could feel like erasing evidence, even when the evidence itself resided elsewhere. It was rather like burning letters, she reflected, even when one knew the recipient had already read them. The act of destruction provided a sense of security that logic might not entirely support, but emotion demanded. And if one were concerned about scrutiny, about questions that might be asked or connections that might be drawn, one might well decide that a bench where private business had been conducted was better replaced by roses that could be admired without raising any uncomfortable inquiries about what had previously occupied their place. The question that remained was whether the roses had been planted to enhance the garden's symmetry, as Mrs. Fawcett claimed, or to cover something she preferred to keep undisturbed beneath several inches of freshly amended soil and decorative mulch. Chapter 8. A Silence Too Carefully Kept. The week progressed with the measured pace characteristic of early summer in St. Mary Mead, when the days lengthened pleasantly and the village settled into that comfortable routine which made any departure from normalcy immediately conspicuous. Miss Marple went about her usual activities, a meeting of the Women's Institute on Wednesday, morning service on Sunday, tea with Lady Bantry on Friday afternoon, and observed as she did so the subtle shifts occurring in the social landscape surrounding Mrs. Fawcett and Miss Allen. What struck her most forcefully was not what was being said, but what was not being said. The ledger, which had been the subject of such careful implication during and immediately after the garden party, was no longer mentioned in direct conversation. Questions about its whereabouts had ceased. No one spoke of searching for it, of organising efforts to locate it, or of pursuing any of the practical steps one might expect when an important document had gone missing. Instead, there had settled over the matter a peculiar sort of silence, as though everyone had agreed without explicitly agreeing that the subject was closed, the conclusion reached, and further discussion unnecessary. It was the silence that follows a verdict, Miss Marple reflected, even when no trial has been conducted and no formal judgment pronounced. She encountered this silence most clearly on Thursday afternoon, when she attended the monthly meeting of the Parish Council's Charitable Committee. The gathering took place in the church hall, and the usual members were present: Mrs. Peake, Mrs. Thornton, the vicar, and several others whose names appeared regularly on the village rosters. Mrs. Fawcett, notably, had sent her apologies, citing a minor indisposition that prevented her attendance. The meeting proceeded through its agenda with reasonable efficiency. Various matters were discussed and decided: the allocation of funds for a family whose breadwinner had been injured, the approval of a small grant for repairs to the village school's roof, the planning of a harvest festival that would benefit several local causes. But when the financial report was presented, Miss Marple noticed something significant in what was not included. There was no mention of the ledger, no reference to its absence, no discussion of how records should be maintained in its unavailability, no suggestion that temporary measures needed to be implemented until it could be recovered. The accounts were presented as though the ledger had never existed, or as though its existence was a matter too delicate to be raised in present company. Mrs. Peake, presiding in Mrs. Fawcett's absence, conducted the meeting with brisk efficiency, and when Mrs. Thornton ventured to ask whether they ought not to address the question of record-keeping going forward, Mrs. Peake dismissed the concern with practised ease. "I believe Mrs. Fawcett has matters well in hand," she said in a tone that discouraged further inquiry. "We need not trouble ourselves with administrative details that are being managed appropriately elsewhere." It was a masterful deflection, Miss Marple thought. The implied trust in Mrs. Fawcett's management served simultaneously to close the subject and to reinforce her position of authority. No one present would wish to appear to doubt Mrs. Fawcett's competence or integrity, and so the matter was allowed to rest, settled by the weight of her reputation, rather than by any actual resolution of the underlying question. After the meeting concluded, Miss Marple found herself walking back toward the High Street alongside the vicar, who appeared troubled by something he was reluctant to articulate directly. "I confess," he said after they had walked some distance in companionable silence, "that I find the situation regarding Miss Allen rather distressing. She has been a faithful volunteer for many years, and it seems harsh that she should be. Well, perhaps I am overstating the matter, but it does seem that she has been rather set aside from responsibilities she formerly held." Miss Marple expressed sympathy with this observation, and the vicar continued with increasing frankness. "I suggested to Mrs. Peake that we might involve Miss Allen in the harvest festival planning, as she has always been so capable with such events. But Mrs. Peake felt it would be better to spare her the burden this year, given her recent difficulties. Those were her exact words, her recent difficulties. And yet, when I inquired what difficulties she meant, Mrs. Peake merely said that some things were better left unspoken, and that we must trust those who understood the full situation to make appropriate decisions. This crystallized something Miss Marple had been observing throughout the week. Miss Allen had indeed been quietly but effectively removed from the various positions of minor responsibility she had previously occupied. She was no longer asked to help organize events, no longer consulted about practical arrangements, no longer included in the small group of reliable volunteers who could be counted upon to manage parish business. And yet this removal had been accomplished without any formal accusation, without any explicit statement of wrongdoing, without even a clear explanation of what had allegedly occurred. It was, Miss Marple reflected, a remarkably efficient method of social exclusion. By leaving everything unspoken, those who had orchestrated Miss Allen's removal from favour protected themselves from the burden of proof. One could not defend oneself against accusations that had never been made, could not demand evidence of wrongdoing that had never been formally alleged, could not appeal a judgment that had never been officially pronounced. What made the situation particularly effective was that it relied entirely on Mrs. Fawcett's established reputation for good judgment and charitable intent. Her past generosity was well documented, her contributions to village life were numerous and visible, her character had been built up over many years of careful, respectable conduct. That accumulated goodwill now served as a shield, protecting her from the sort of scrutiny that might have been applied to someone less well regarded. Miss Marple thought of cases she had known where similar patterns had emerged. There had been a situation in another village many years ago involving a wealthy landowner who had managed estate accounts with considerable flexibility, helping tenant farmers through difficult seasons by adjusting rents in ways that were compassionate but perhaps not strictly aligned with the terms of their agreements. When questions had arisen about the accounting, blame had been quietly directed toward the estate manager, a competent but socially insignificant man who had been following the landowner's instructions but lacked the standing to defend himself effectively. The manager had eventually departed under a cloud, and the landowner's reputation had remained intact, his generosity remembered and his irregularities forgotten. The parallel was instructive. In both cases, someone of established position and respected character had engaged in flexible interpretations of procedure, motivated perhaps by genuine compassion, but straying into territory that invited questions. And in both cases, when those questions threatened to arise, someone of lesser standing had been positioned to absorb the consequences. What troubled Miss Marple most was not the possibility that Mrs. Fawcett had made irregular adjustments to charitable accounts. Such adjustments, if made with good intent and for genuine need, might well deserve understanding rather than censure. What troubled her was the willingness to let another person bear the weight of uncertainty, to allow Marjorie Allen's reputation to be damaged by implication rather than risk her own being examined by inquiry. As she settled into her chair that evening, reviewing the week's observations with the methodical care she brought to such matters, Miss Marple reflected that silence could be as revealing as speech, and sometimes more so. What had not been said spoke volumes about what was being protected, and at what cost to those who lacked the standing to demand a hearing. The question now was whether that silence could be broken, and whether the truths it concealed could be brought into light without causing more harm than the concealment itself had created. It was, Miss Marple thought, a question that would require careful consideration, and perhaps a degree of courage that village life did not often demand, but sometimes made necessary. Chapter 9. How the Story Was Redirected. Saturday afternoon brought with it a quality of light that suggested autumn was still some way off, but no longer entirely unimaginable. Miss Marple was in her garden, deadheading roses with the methodical patience the task required, when she observed Mrs. Fawcett approaching along the lane. It was not an unexpected visit. Miss Marple had sent a note the previous day suggesting that Mrs. Fawcett might find it convenient to call, phrasing the invitation with sufficient delicacy that it could be declined without awkwardness, but carried enough weight to suggest declining would be unwise. Mrs. Fawcett arrived precisely at the appointed hour, dressed with her usual understated elegance, and carrying herself with the composure that had served her well throughout the various trials of the past fortnight. Miss Marple welcomed her warmly, led her to the small table set beneath the apple tree, and poured tea with the unhurried grace of someone who understood that important conversations required proper setting. They spoke for some minutes of inconsequential matters, the weather, the success of the garden party in raising funds for the nursing service, the general health of various village residents. It was the sort of preliminary conversation that established civility, whilst both parties gathered themselves for what would follow. Miss Marple had perfected this approach over many years, understanding that people were more inclined to honesty when they had been treated with courtesy and given time to find their footing. Eventually, when the teacups had been refilled and a comfortable rhythm established, Miss Marple set down her cup with gentle finality and addressed the matter that had brought them together. "I wonder," she said, in a tone that was thoughtful rather than accusatory, "whether you might tell me what truly happened to the ledger. I ask not from idle curiosity, but because I believe the truth of the matter may be rather different from what has been generally supposed." Mrs. Fawcett's composure flickered slightly, though she recovered almost immediately. "I'm not certain what you mean, Miss Marple. The ledger was mislaid, as I mentioned. These things happen." "Ah, but you see, I don't believe it was mislaid at all," Miss Marple replied, her voice remaining gentle but carrying a quiet certainty. "I believe it was set aside quite deliberately, and that the suggestion of its loss served a purpose that had nothing to do with actual misplacement." There was a pause, during which Mrs. Fawcett seemed to be weighing her options. Miss Marple waited patiently, allowing the silence to do its work. She had learned long ago that silence could be more persuasive than any argument, that people often found the burden of maintaining pretense more exhausting than the relief of acknowledgement. "You are very perceptive," Mrs. Fawcett said at last, her voice carefully controlled. "May I ask what led you to this conclusion?" Several things, Miss Marple replied. The timing of the rosebed's installation, for instance, removing the bench where you had been accustomed to reviewing private papers. The discrepancy between your recollection of when Miss Allen fetched twine from the potting shed and the accounts provided by both Miss Allen and Mr. Reed, who independently recalled it occurring much earlier and in the presence of witnesses. The curious fact that no actual search has been conducted for the ledger, no real effort made to recover what was supposedly an important document. She paused to take a sip of tea before continuing. But most tellingly, there has been the quality of silence surrounding the entire matter. If the ledger had truly been lost through Miss Allen's carelessness, one would expect either a direct accusation or a direct defence. Instead, there has been only implication, carefully cultivated but never explicitly stated. That suggested to me that the ledger's disappearance was never the actual problem, but rather a means of directing attention elsewhere. Mrs. Fawcett sat very still, her teacup held in both hands as though it provided some necessary anchor. When she spoke, her voice carried a weariness that had not been present before. The ledger contains records of adjustments I made over the years, she said quietly. Small redirections of charitable funds to families in genuine need, managed discreetly to spare them the embarrassment of formal application processes. Every decision was made in good faith. Every penny went to legitimate need, but the documentation would not bear close scrutiny by someone determined to find fault with procedure rather than acknowledge compassionate intent. And you feared such scrutiny was imminent? Miss Marple asked gently. Mrs. Peake has been conducting an audit of parish finances, Mrs. Fawcett explained. She mentioned it some weeks ago, said it was merely routine, but I understood the implication. She's always resented the discretion I was permitted in managing charitable distributions, has always felt that proper procedure should take precedence over individual circumstances. The ledger would have provided her with exactly the ammunition she required to question my judgment publicly. Miss Marple nodded slowly, understanding the position Mrs. Fawcett had found herself in. And so you concealed the ledger, and allowed suspicion to settle upon Miss Allen instead. Not suspicion of theft, Mrs. Fawcett said quickly. Merely of carelessness. I thought if the ledger were temporarily unavailable, and if it appeared that Miss Allen had perhaps misplaced it during her helpful efforts in the potting shed, the matter would be closed without further inquiry. Miss Allen would bear a small burden of implied incompetence, but nothing truly damaging, and the questions I wished to avoid would remain unasked. But the burden proved rather larger than you anticipated, Miss Marple observed. Miss Allen has been effectively removed from all her volunteer positions, excluded from activities she has faithfully supported for years, made to feel that her presence is no longer welcome in circles where she had previously belonged. The weight of uncertainty you allowed to settle upon her has been considerably heavier than mere incompetence. Mrs. Fawcett set down her teacup with a slight tremor in her hands. I did not intend for matters to progress so far. Mrs. Peake took the implication and ran with it in ways I had not anticipated. I found myself unable to correct the trajectory without exposing what I had initially concealed. Yes, Miss Marple said quietly. That is often how these matters develop. A small misdirection, undertaken for what seems a reasonable purpose, creates momentum that becomes difficult to control. And those who lack standing or accumulated goodwill find themselves crushed by mechanisms they never set in motion, but cannot stop. She looked directly at Mrs. Fawcett, her expression sympathetic but firm. The wrongdoing, Mrs. Fawcett, lies not in the adjustments you made to help families in need. From what I understand, those were acts of genuine compassion, however irregular the procedure. The wrongdoing lies in your willingness to let another person bear the cost of protecting you from questions about those acts. Miss Allen has done nothing wrong, yet she has been made to pay for your fear of scrutiny. Mrs. Fawcett sat in silence for a long moment, and when she finally spoke, her voice carried a note of something that might have been shame, or might have been resignation. What would you have me do? I would have you restore what you have taken from Miss Allen, Miss Marple replied. Her standing, her position, her sense of being valued and trusted. the ledger must reappear, complete and without explanation, beyond a simple acknowledgement that it was never truly lost. Miss Allen must be publicly restored to her previous responsibilities, with enough warmth in the restoration that no shadow remains upon her character. And if I do this, the contents of the ledger will be examined? Perhaps, Miss Marple said honestly, though I suspect that if the ledger reappears intact and Miss Allen is clearly vindicated, Mrs. Peake's interest in auditing your particular records may wane considerably. She has been interested in the mystery rather than the accounting, I think. Remove the mystery, and her curiosity may well be satisfied. Mrs. Fawcett rose from her chair, her composure restored, though perhaps more fragile than before. You're very kind, Miss Marple, to phrase this as advice rather than judgment. I am realistic about human nature, Miss Marple corrected gently. We all make errors of judgment when we are frightened or cornered. What matters is whether we have the courage to acknowledge those errors and attempt to repair the damage they have caused. After Mrs. Fawcett had departed, Miss Marple remained in her garden, watching the afternoon light shift through the apple leaves and reflecting that truth, once spoken, had a curious way of changing the shape of everything around it, like a stone dropped into still water creating ripples that reached far beyond the initial disturbance. Chapter 10, Beds Left in Order, Truths Left Bare. The ledger reappeared on Tuesday morning, discovered by the vicar on his desk at the church office with no accompanying note or explanation. It was complete, every page intact, every entry legible, showing nothing more scandalous than a record of charitable work conducted with more heart than strict adherence to procedure might have preferred. The vicar mentioned its return at the parish council meeting that afternoon, expressing relief that the mystery had been resolved, though he did not speculate about where it had been or how it had found its way back to its proper place. Mrs. Peake accepted this development with the grace of someone who recognised that further inquiry would serve no useful purpose. Her interest in auditing Mrs. Fawcett's records appeared to have waned considerably, just as Miss Marple had predicted it might. When mysteries lost their air of intrigue, they often lost their appeal entirely, and Mrs. Peake was not one to pursue administrative detail for its own sake once the social dimension had been removed. What followed the ledger's return was more significant than the return itself. On Wednesday afternoon, Mrs. Fawcett called upon Marjorie Allen at her small cottage on the edge of the village. The visit lasted perhaps 20 minutes, and those who observed Mrs. Fawcett's departure noted that her expression carried a quality of solemnity that suggested the conversation had not been entirely comfortable. Miss Allen herself said very little about what had transpired, but when she appeared at the Women's Institute meeting on Friday, she was greeted with a warmth that had been notably absent in recent weeks. Mrs. Fawcett, who attended the same meeting, made a point of asking Miss Allen's advice on the arrangements for the Harvest Festival, and did so with enough deference that everyone present understood a restoration had occurred. "I have been remiss," Mrs. Fawcett said in a tone that carried to all corners of the hall, "in failing to acknowledge how much Miss Allen contributes to our parish activities. I hope she will forgive my thoughtlessness and agree to resume the responsibilities she has always managed so capably." Miss Allen accepted this with quiet dignity, neither making much of the apology nor rejecting it with false modesty. She simply agreed that she would be happy to help with the Harvest Festival, and the matter was settled with a completeness that suggested both parties understood exactly what had been acknowledged and what had been tactfully left unsaid. In the days that followed, other adjustments became apparent. Mrs. Fawcett sent a letter to a former employer of Miss Allen's cousin in the next county, providing a reference of such warmth and specificity that it resulted in Miss Allen being offered a position as secretary to a charitable foundation in Salisbury. The position carried considerably more prestige and remuneration than anything available in St. Mary Mead, and Miss Allen accepted it with what appeared to be genuine pleasure, mixed with the natural regret of leaving familiar surroundings. Mrs. Fawcett herself announced, citing fatigue and the press of personal matters, that she would be stepping back from several of her parish responsibilities. She would remain available for consultation, she assured everyone, but felt it was time for others to assume the active management of various committees and charitable endeavours she had overseen for so many years. The announcement was received with expressions of regret and understanding, though Miss Marple noted that certain members of the parish council appeared relieved to have their procedures returned to more conventional channels. The garden at Rosebery Cottage remained as beautiful as ever, its roses continuing to bloom with the perfection that careful tending could achieve. But when people spoke of it now, there was a subtle shift in tone. The admiration remained, but it was tempered by something less easily defined, a recognition, perhaps, that even the most carefully maintained gardens could harbour complications beneath their ordered surfaces. Miss Marple, taking her evening walk past Rosebery Cottage some weeks after these events had settled into the village's collective memory, paused to admire the herbaceous border where the delphiniums had now been succeeded by late summer blooms. The garden showed no sign of the small drama that had unfolded within and around it. The roses in the new bed had established themselves beautifully, their roots reaching down into soil that held no secrets except those that all garden soil holds. The organic matter of past seasons, the quiet work of earthworms and decay, the patient alchemy through which old growth becomes the foundation for new. She thought of Marjorie Allen, now settled in her new position, and reportedly thriving in an environment where her capabilities were recognised without the shadow of doubt. She thought of Mrs. Fawcett, who had learned something about the cost of self-protection, and perhaps about the dangers of allowing small deceptions to grow into larger injuries. She thought of the village itself, which had witnessed a minor drama play out according to familiar patterns, reputation tested, character judged, equilibrium eventually restored, though perhaps not entirely in the configuration that had existed before. What struck Miss Marple most as she continued her walk homeward through the lengthening shadows was how little had actually been acknowledged directly. The ledger had returned without explanation. The apology to Miss Allen had been phrased in terms of thoughtlessness rather than deliberate injury. The stepping back from responsibilities had been attributed to fatigue rather than to any recognition of wrongdoing. Village life had a remarkable capacity for absorbing uncomfortable truths and transmuting them into acceptable narratives, smoothing rough edges until the essential facts became less important than the general sense that matters had been appropriately resolved. Perhaps this was not entirely a bad thing, Miss Marple reflected. Human beings were fallible creatures, and village life required a certain tolerance for fallibility if it was to continue functioning. Perfect justice would leave no one standing, and perfect transparency would make social existence unbearable. There was something to be said for allowing people to correct their errors without forcing them to articulate every detail of what had gone wrong, for accepting restoration as sufficient without demanding complete confession. And yet, she thought, it was important that someone understood what had actually occurred, not for the purpose of punishment or exposure, but simply because truth mattered even when it was not spoken aloud. Someone needed to remember that order could be restored without full acknowledgement, but that such restoration came at a cost, and that cost was always borne by someone, usually by those who lacked the standing or the accumulated goodwill to protect themselves when blame needed to be distributed and appearances needed to be preserved. The garden at Rosebery Cottage would continue to be admired, as it deserved to be. Mrs. Fawcett would continue to be respected for her years of charitable work, as